IVM.
In 1857, the First War of Independence was what created the form of the colonial Indian Army, of the Army of the Raj. And World War II is actually what created the form of the modern Indian Army and created all the disruptions that produced the army we have today. That included making space for the first time for women.
My guest today is one of the most exciting Indian journalists and writers around. His 2016 book, Farthest Field, an Indian story of the Second World War, won the coveted Wyndham Campbell Literature Prize and also the Sahitya Academy Yuva Puraskar Award. Raghu Karnad is also a contributing writer to many publications like The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and The Guardian. And he's also bureau chief for The Wire. Raghu has spent a lot of time in different parts of India, and I want to talk to him about the wars that India had fought outside and is still fighting internally. Welcome to the Filter Coffee podcast, Raghu.
Thank you.
Raghu, I want to start with your book, The Farthest Field, which is on India's involvement in the Second World War. And there are a couple of things I had heard before I started reading the book.
Well, if you've heard a couple of things, then you have an advantage over most of the people in this country.
One of them is the fact that the first Allied victory ever in the World War II was by an Indian army in North Africa. Is this a correct factoid?
I think that the one you might be thinking of is even more surprising than that. One of the first victories of the British Empire forces was actually in East Africa in this very impressive storming of a mountaintop fort called Dolo Gorodok. But basically the defeat of the Italians in Eritrea and Ethiopia was a massive campaign, hugely involving Indian forces, which is sadly just one of the many sort of campaigns and theaters that's totally forgotten from the history of the Second World War. And it happened fairly early into, for instance, it happened when the North African campaign was still warming up.
Right. Yeah. This is around the 1940...
I think so. This was probably in 1941.
At its peak, I think roughly about 2 million soldiers from India were fighting the
2.5 million people serving in the army, in the services during the war, yeah.
Wow. That's a fairly large number, right? How does that compare to all the other allies per se?
One of the things we don't want to do is to take away from this that India was one of the foremost. So let's put this number into perspective. 2.5 million troops made the Indian army the largest army that has ever raised without conscription. So a volunteer army.
Wow.
Not just in World War II, but in human history. The Indian army was a historic entity at this point, this is a landmark. Of course, at the same time, the Soviet army, which was the Red Army, which is then and still remains the most underrated fighting force and military force that has ever existed, was practically involved the entire citizenry of the Soviet Union. I don't remember what the size of the enrolled army was at that point, but you don't have to compare what the strength of the Indian army was to the most powerful countries on the front line, to Germany or the Soviet Union.
Right.
You really just have to compare it to our sense of what it was, which is something that's, at most, if we think about it as being a kind of backwaters police force in those years, whereas in fact it was an extremely powerful army that was roving around the world and fighting and serving a very important part in key theaters in fighting fascism.
Right. Your book, The Farthest Field, is largely about what we're talking about, right? Before we go further into this, how did this come into being? What was your fascination with this?
I think like a lot of young people, and probably especially young men, I had a kind of amateurish fascination for World War II. And as a journalist, I was obviously very interested and tried to understand a lot about modern Indian history. But somehow, right through most of my 20s even, I'd never really thought about how those two overlapped. It never even occurred to me that there was a significant overlap there. Then, I was working in Delhi and having a conversation with my mother, and she mentioned her uncle, whom she said had gone off to serve in World War II, and then she said had died playing Russian roulette. So I thought, what? What is this story? What was he doing playing Russian roulette? And anyway, what was he doing in World War II? I'd never think about Indians doing that in any case. So my family is from Madras, and this side of my family are Parsis. Anyway, it turned out that all of the young men from that generation, from that side of my family, went off and fought in the Second World War in different services, in the Air Force, in the sappers, which is the engineering sort of corps, and in the medical service. And the women too had extremely dramatic and sort of were deeply involved in the war effort.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. In the sense that my grandmother was a doctor in Madras hospitals, were very involved, were drawn into the vortex of the war as well because of the number of refugees arriving in Madras.
So, 2.5 million people you're talking about. Yeah. Did it involve any women at that point, either on field or off field?
This was the very beginning of the involvement. So, World War II is when the modern Indian army actually begins to form. In 1857, the First War of Independence was what created the form of the colonial Indian army, of the army of the Raj. And World War II is actually what created the form of the modern Indian army and created all the disruptions that produced the army we have today. That included making space for the first time for women. Now, it is a very limited space. They were called women auxiliaries, who worked sort of as junior officers, you might say. And they were a very limited social class of women who gravitated towards that. They were mainly Anglo-Indians and sort of upper-class Muslim women and so on. But that's not to minimize their role at all. It was completely revolutionary and radical at that time. And of course, you didn't have to be enrolled to be a part of the war effort. What was also happening through the rest, this 2.5 million figure, actually seriously discounts the effect that the war had on India, because India was industrializing and it was transforming, and every single part of the country was being touched by the war in some form, whether it was road building to a training camp for Chinese soldiers in the heartland of central India, or whether it was being a young doctor who was serving in a hospital for Burmese refugees in Madras. Women were drawn into the labor force much more because 2.5 million men had been taken out of it.
Right. That's a fascinating story. When you were talking about this earlier, you mentioned that it's the largest voluntary army. How did that happen? What were they signing up for? To fight the Second World War?
Voluntary is a technical term.
Right.
And what it means is that there was no law that required Indians of a certain age or so on to join the forces. There was no conscription law. And that was what existed. Now, the Indian Army was not the largest army, as I said earlier, in World War II by any measure.
Of course.
But all of those larger armies, all of them, were raised by conscription. If you were in the Soviet Union, if you were in Britain, if you're even in the United States, you had to fight. Right? In India, that was not the situation. The political situation would not allow it.
Right.
Nor was it required. There were a whole range of reasons that motivated Indians to fight. And they ranged from in families where there was a legacy and a tradition of service in regiments. There was a kind of a Pulton legacy. Men had been serving in the same regiment for generations. On the other hand, so that motive was valor and tradition and loyalty to a regiment that ran through a family. On the other hand, there were many parts of India that were suffering an intense food crisis that preceded the famine that we know of in Bengal. And many, many people were actually were signing up in order to get 3 square meals a day. And in between, there's just as many reasons as there are people, in a sense. You know, there are lots of young communists who refused to fight the war, seeing it as an imperialist war, until 1941, when Germany attacked the Soviet Union, at which point they quickly changed their minds and realized that it was an anti-fascist war.
Right.
That this was now a war to defend the kind of the heartland of communism. And then they all went and signed up, and, this is all like Presidency College and so on, and joined the British Army. young communists in the British Army. Lots of contradictions like this, things like that. A very profound reason that will be of interest to people who read the book or who are listening to us now is that this was the first time, and again, that transformative moment for the Indian Army. This was the first time that there was a place in the Indian Army for this new middle class that existed. If you had an engineering degree or a medical degree or really a degree of any kind, this was the first time that you could become an officer. Prior to this, the fundamental design of the Indian Army was that Europeans were officers and Indians were in the ranks. Europeans commanded and Indians obeyed. Now, under the pressure to expand the army so fast, they had to throw open the gates to Indian officers. And that was what transformed the war. That was what transformed the army so totally.
Did it change hierarchy at some level?
It changed hierarchy. It totally dissolved the kind of reliability of the army as a colonial instrument. Because now if you have Indians who are officers and they're being promoted as officers, and suddenly you have Indians who are becoming brigadiers and colonels and so on, you're looking at an army going forward in which the commanding ranks are natives, as they used to say. And once that is your military instrument in a country, you really have to rethink how long you can maintain your occupation of that country.
You touched upon the infrastructure that was happening in central India at this point, etc. Did the war actually inadvertently also sort of help build India from an infrastructure perspective?
It did, in fact. I think that it's a very understudied period in terms of the history of sort of state finance and infrastructure and industrialization in India. Because again, it was another way in which Britain was forced to change the terms of trade between the colony and the metropole. So it was a period in which a lot of industrial investment happened and a lot of new plants were constructed to enable. Now, I don't want to go off on a diversion here. But to understand how important India was in the scheme of the world in 1942, for instance, and we don't see the world this way. We have to try and visualize it. Visualize Britain. It's on the other side of a continent that is now completely controlled by European fascism. It's stuck over there. And it's not that easy in 1942 to fly over the continent. All of Britain's the entire British Empire, most of it stretching from South Africa and this giant arc through India down to Australia, is free. Or rather, it's part of the British Empire. It's not free, but it's free from the Axis. This is the body of the empire, totally cut off geographically. And what's at the heart of this body? It's India. And Britain has a bureaucracy there. It has a viceroy. George Orwell actually said this in 1942. He said, India is now the center of the war, and therefore it is the center of the world. This is the scale of the kind of geopolitics we've forgotten. So that also meant that it was necessitated for Britain to strengthen India wholeheartedly. Or I can't say wholeheartedly. It was they had to now, without restrictions, allow India to begin to industrialize and to be able to provide more muscle. For their own survival.
As a supplier.
Okay.
I'll come to this part of it in a bit. But why isn't anyone speaking about this? Or why isn't this part of the World War II books?
It's funny, that's in my book, that's sort of the central question. I think that for me, I was writing about the specific subject was military history, but the larger question that I was pondering was one about historical memory and personal memory, and how it's possible for us to forget something that's so massive. This is the largest military experience Indians have ever had, right? I was being interviewed by a young journalist once, soon after the book came out, and I was telling her this. I was like, it's the largest military experience that Indians have ever participated in. And she said, I see, sir. So you mean it was larger than Kargil? And I was like, okay, yeah, it was definitely larger than Kargil, but I understand why you're confused about which one is more significant. There are lots of different ways to measure significance. The real reason that World War II has kind of dropped off the page is that it's just very inconvenient history.
For us or for Britain?
For everybody. Britain wants to remember World War II as its brave little struggle against the bad guys. It's very inconvenient for the British to remember that right until World War II started, they were the bad guys.
Yes.
And even through the entire duration of the war, when they were fighting for freedom, they were fighting to maintain their empire of domination across the whole world. This is the fact that there's a total continuity between the age of colonialism and this moment of global fascism is something that Britain doesn't really want to think about,
right?
If you follow me. But Hitler was very inspired by the British Empire in many ways. And so Britain has done a better job than we have, but it's really downgraded the role and the place of the colonial armies and the colonies in fighting the war. As for us,
yes,
very soon after the end of the war, we were tossed into a totally new which was independence and partition.
Yeah,
partition really tore up a lot of our common historical legacy, and including inside the army in some ways. And independence just made it suddenly very important for us to write a new history, to write a history essentially centered on the freedom struggle. The story of modern India was the story of the Congress-led freedom struggle.
So essentially breaking news won even back then.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was more than breaking news.
Right.
That was nation building. And nation building involved describing the Indian army as something that belonged newly to this new nation. Of course, that's not really the case. The Indian army remained more or less exactly the same as it had under the Raj, and the institution was the same one. They just changed which flag they were saluting.
Right, which actually brings me to the political side of this, right? So in a way, the war also, at least the discourse is that the war hastened British exit, and it also started the Quit India movement, etc. Right? But correct me if I'm wrong. Not all political parties were on the same page about India's participation in the war. Right?
Yeah,
I'm assuming the Muslim League was on a different page, and the Congress was on a different page, isn't it?
Yeah. Many of them, for instance, were on different pages at different times. Like I said about the Communist Party. And the Communist Party was a very significant political force.
Right.
It was the most strident force against the British Raj at the time. So much so that it was, I think, an illegal party for most of the duration of the war. The Congress had a strong reservations that turned into an outright sort of rejection of the war effort, which took the form of the Quit India movement. And other smaller parties, including the Muslim League and the Hindu Mahasabha, took much more sort of pragmatic positions. And I actually probably want to double check this, but smaller parties tended to take positions that were more aligned with the British government.
With the British government. Okay, interesting.
And of course, then there were the princes. The princes were also in India, the princely states at that point occupied more space than the presidencies which made up the British imperial territory. And so the princes also had different positions, and many of them were very loyally aligned with the British Empire in this moment.
Right, understood. Just going a few minutes back into the conversation, we were talking about the things that Britain doesn't want to talk about anymore. And I was recently, listening to a Malcolm Gladwell episode in his series, The Revisionist History, where he speaks about the Bengal famine and a gentleman called Frederick Lindemann, who might have had an impact on Churchill's decisions to not send food supplies to that, right? I mean, his point of view is largely Lindemann, who was also a scientist and one of Churchill's very close friends.
Right.
He was driving most of the decision making, right, including whether there should be air raids on Germany or not, and whether ships which were actually halting for refueling in Bombay should actually send some supplies to Bengal to fight the famine or not.
Yes.
But from what you were talking about earlier, definitely the Bengal famine would have been handled differently if not for the war, isn't it?
Yes, I think there's no question about that. Since you mentioned Lindemann, I don't know this story, but scientists have had plenty of blood on their hands when it comes to famine in the past. There's a famous Soviet scientist named Lysenko who authored the most sort of destructive policies for Soviet agriculture. Ideology gets in everywhere, and that you see that when you look back at history. So we have to use that perspective when we look at the present as well.
Fair point. On that note, we'll take a quick break. We'll talking to Raghu Karnad about the different wars that India has fought. And when we come back, we'll talk to him about the internal wars that we fought and are still fighting.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another week on the IVM Podcast Network. As always, it's an awesome week. We'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this month as well, Savari, Storytel, and Paytm Money. Just a reminder, we're hiring some people. We're looking for producers, content creators, audio engineers, developers. Check out our careers page on our website. And if you're interested in working at the most awesome place in the world, please do send us your application. We have a few new shows launching. So the first new show we got launching is called Mr. and Mrs. Binge Watch. It's hosted by Janice Sequeira and Anirudh Goa. They're a TV-crazy, Netflix-loving, binge-watching couple who snort television for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They talk about the shows they binge on and a whole lot more. New episodes are out every Thursday on our network. Another new show we have is called Edges and Sledges. It's a cricket podcast where Varun, Ashwin, and DJ talk all about cricket. This week they have Tatenda Taibu, the former Zimbabwe captain, as their guest. It's the ICC World Cup season, so definitely check this one out. On the scene and the unseen, Shruti Rajgopalan returns as Amit Verma's favorite guest to discuss the CJI Ranjan Gogoi case, its loopholes, the politicization of the case, and judicial activism. On paperback, for the first time, Racheta and Satyajit discuss a work of fiction. They discuss the Harry Potter series with Tanisha Phagwani, founder and CEO of EFGstore.in. On our Marathi podcast, Golgappa, Trupti is joined by Gitanjali Gondale, founder of Moha by Gitanjali, an artisanal accessory brand, to talk about how she became a self-taught jewelry designer, her latest collections, and the current trends in the market. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam is joined by transformation mentor Srinivasan Ranganathan to talk about how religion, knowledge, and the desire to make money can help you with better wealth management decisions. On Geek Fruit, Tejas and Dinkar interviewed Taruk Raina, the star of last year's hit Disney stage production Aladdin. They talk about the live-action adaptation of Aladdin and compare it with the animated classic. On IVM Likes, Janam and Abhineet are joined by the two ultimate Game of Thrones nerds, Gauri Pandit and Dhriti Menon, to talk about the final season of the ambitious TV show. And with that, let's go on with your show.
Welcome back to the Filter Coffee podcast. Before we went on a break, we spoke to Raghu Karnad about his book, Farthest Field, which, among other things, has also won one of the most prestigious literary awards, which is the Wyndham Campbell Award, isn't it?
Yes.
How do you feel about that?
I should have a prepared answer for this at this point, but I feel truly very good about the fact that this book on this subject, which is a subject that is almost by definition an obscure and sort of forgotten one. I didn't know whether it would connect with people in India, let alone with a jury sitting in the United States. So the fact that this prize kind of confirms that the book found a treatment and found an approach and found the words to tell this story meaningfully, that means a lot to me. It does. Apart from that, it's really weird to get a big prize. I have to be honest, that is truly the main reaction. It takes kind of a lot of processing, and it's sometimes hard to feel like you deserve it.
Does it make you want to spend more time writing?
Definitely.
You are writing in any case, but more in a journalistic way since then.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost like kind of a command from a flaming bush or whatever the biblical reference is. But yeah, when something like this is given to you, it's like seeing landing lights just kind of lighting up in front of you. You know what direction you should go, and you know that there's a safe kind of tarmac there waiting for you. So
right. Talking of writing beyond books, your journey started with The Wire, where you are the bureau chief. Pretty much when the journey started for Wire itself.
Yeah.
Right? How has that been? It's been, 3-4 years now?
It's been 4 years.
4 years, yeah.
It's been extremely interesting, obviously, since when we started off, The Wire comprised of 5 people, 5 laptops in 4 different cities, one WordPress-based website, no budget, no team, no office.
Why did you start The Wire?
It's possible that each of the 5 people involved had their own driving motivations. I know that Siddharth Varadarajan realized, so this was 1 year post the election of the Modi government. I know that Siddharth Varadarajan realized, and the rest of us were a little bit slower to realize, that the rules were going to be extremely different for the media and for how aggressively the media could prosecute questions about the government. and how much sort of like counter propaganda a journalist would encounter just for asking questions, I came up as a journalist in, broadly speaking, UPA 2, when all I can remember is people just ragging the government all day long, right? Mm. I mean, I did too. Like CAG report came out, India Against Corruption was like rolling out across Delhi, and it wasn't just that. I mean, I worked for Tehelka and for Outlook, what we now think of as fairly like either liberal or full-blown lefty places, but everything I wrote was, in my own capacity, was critical of the Congress government or of the CPIM. We criticized, they were critical of Operation Green Hunt, which is the operation against the Maoists. They were critical of the development policy of SEZs. I wrote about Bhopal and I wrote about Nandigram and so on. Just as recently as 15 years ago, there was an incredibly robust sort of strength in the media to criticize the government. Now, not only do we not have that, we've forgotten that we had that it existed, and we're denying that it existed. Now it's like, it's always been the same. Us waqt mein, there was an pro-Congress establishment. Now there's a pro-BJP establishment. It's exactly the same. It is not the same. And I hope that younger people actually realize this. It is emphatically not the same. What it feels like to be a journalist is very different now. And that's why The Wire sort of exists to cultivate a small space in which there is, it's fair to say, no hesitation to ask tough questions of the government whatsoever.
Right. And for the benefit of the audience, who are the five? It's you, Siddharth Varadarajan, and...
At the outset, there were the three founding editors, who are Siddharth Varadarajan, former editor of The Hindu, Siddharth Bhatia, who was based in Bombay and was part of the team that started DNA, and M.K. Venu, who's also part of The Hindu. There was me, and there was a young, brilliant chap named Mukund. He's still our science and environment editor, right. Mukund Vasudevan.
Right. That was a time when a lot of alternative journalism was cropping up. I think the Quint was establishing itself in some sort. Catch News was a different kind of an organization back then. Right from the get-go, there was a certain identity to The Wire, right? Mm-hmm. It is not just the anti-establishment, which is what most... Not anti-establishment, questioning and challenging the establishment, which is what journalism should be.
Right.
But it also, at least to the layman, seemed like you come from a certain ideology which drove your beliefs.
Yeah.
Right. Whether we call it left or right, we'll talk about that separately.
Right.
It doesn't matter. Was that the intent, or is that how it just you just expressed yourself?
I think you've put your finger on something that's very true about The Wire that people don't often identify, which is that The Wire arrived with a set of values, I think you could call them political values, that essentially meant that we showed up with our dukes up and ready to fight. So one of those values is, and I don't mind saying this on the record, is like opposition to communalism, opposition to political sort of rise of Hindutva, opposition to a lot of the ways in which, and outspoken opposition to the ways in which those forces are penetrating institutions that are meant to work free of those forces. So there are plenty of other news startups, as you said, and many of them were taking more circumspect positions in the sense that they were focused on being professional news organizations, and they would do their reporting. And Scroll is obviously the key example there. Right. And Scroll has really distinguished itself in these years with the quality of its reporting from the field across the country, right? But The Wire people understood from the outset, and this is what enabled us to grow despite not having no money and no office. People understood that The Wire was going to be representing a community that is not necessarily left or right, and certainly not pro-Congress, which is what we get accused of all the time.
Right.
But a community that had some continuities with the kind of journalism that I was describing from earlier, which was one that could be adversarial to the government when necessary, and was one that was really ardent about India's constitutional nature and about criticizing forces that wanted to transform that.
Right. One of the things, one of the allegations, so to say, not an allegation, one of the commentaries that people have.
No, you can just say it. Believe me, I've heard worse. I've probably heard a much more blunt version of this question.
Right, right. Against a Scroll or a Wire is that you play a role equally in polarizing the discourse, right? Which is, extremes of any one thing, right? Is that correct? Is that correct as a criticism? And second part to this question is, and there is the other perception that the Wire doesn't necessarily appreciate a good thing that this government has done since 2014 as well.
Right.
I'm not sure how much that is true.
Okay. Let's take the second one first, because that's easier to dispense with. So we have different kind of verticals in the Wire, as in any news organization. And some of them just get much more play. If you sit on Twitter and wait for Wire articles to reach you, the ones that reach you will be the ones that have the most sort of USP value, in the sense that they're the ones that are the most outspoken, the ones that are throwing their punches the hardest. Sometimes the most provocative pieces on the Wire, or the most
extreme.
No, I don't think that the Wire has published very much that's extreme at all. I just think that our mental space for criticism has really shrunk. But the point I'm making is that if you sit on Twitter and you see what reaches you,
right,
the pieces that travel the most are often the most provocative ones.
Understood.
Right?
Yeah.
Whereas the reporting we have on the railways or on ISRO or whatever it is, those tend to circulate within certain communities that have that interest. They're not going to go viral.
Right.
This creates a little bit of a skew in terms of whether we're incapable of appreciating the government. That said, there was an extremely small team, like extremely hardworking people who do not have a lot of extra bandwidth to go around kissing ass when the rest of the media is busily doing that. Okay? The government gets lots of love. In certain fields, it deserves appreciation. During the election, we published something called the Modi Mark Sheet, which I would encourage people to go and see. In it, we reviewed how the government delivered on all of its promises from the 2014 manifesto. Anyone who has a critical view of the Wire should go take a look at the Modi Mark Sheet. They'll be surprised at what our end result is, because this is when we actually gave a considered ranking or rating to the government's delivery on various governance promises. So I encourage you to go and look that up. But apart from that, we don't have a lot of spare capacity. We're not the Hindu. We're not the Hindustan Times. We don't have spare staffers. We have 30 people producing editions in English, Hindi, Urdu, and video. Our job in the last 5 years, and possibly in the next 5 years, is mainly to ask tough questions of whoever's in power. And that's largely an issue of bandwidth and of focus. And, yeah.
Moving on to another part of your journalistic journey, right? You've been able to spend time on ground, both in contentious parts of the country, like Kashmir, and also in parts of the country where we don't really talk about much, like Orissa and few others as well, right? Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you this, which is, when you see the discourse in the country, right? I think there is the media discourse, the broadcasted discourse, and then there is the discourse that digital sort of enables, right? How do you rate our ability to prioritize what is impactful, what is necessary in the long term for the organization versus what is newsworthy?
Listen, to be honest, I have a strange position as a journalist or as currently a bureau chief, which is that I don't really like the news very much. I don't think that the news, in the sense of breaking news, serves us well as citizens. And I don't think it serves the government well, and I don't think it serves the country well. What the news essentially does is it's this constantly, rapidly moving kind of line of questioning that does not allow much time to look back. We're constantly broaching new subjects, demanding that people pay attention to them, blaring at people that these are the most important subjects concerning the country. And then 3 days later, we're on something, or perhaps 3 hours later now, and we're on something completely new. The whole breaking news paradigm, and more, especially on TV, more and more news is now tilted towards breaking news rather than news with any kind of longevity.
Right.
I think it's clear that it's kind of collapsing our ability to understand what's happening rather than just to gather information.
And one of the casualties of that is different rights movements in the country, right?
Yeah.
Well, there is probably 90% of the coverage is in Kashmir and what's going on there. there are issues from a tribal perspective and even from a caste perspective. Of course, caste does get some coverage because it's dramatic.
But all of these only get coverage really in the context of tragedy or violence.
Right.
And that's, because that provides news. And we don't give them enough time to understand the daily lives or the regular arc of those problems and of those situations in the country.
And many of these are apolitical, right? It's just the way things are at this point. You can't blame any one government for the same. But in particular, what have you found in your journeys to Orissa that you didn't know before?
Well, I wrote a piece that I put a lot of work in for the New Yorker website last year. And it taught me something about journalism that I had not sort of fixed in my mind before, which is that a really good piece of journalism will leave you with more questions at the end than you had at the beginning. Fewer answers and more questions. And that's how I felt after visiting Niyamgiri, to the extent that any tribal issues get widespread attention in India. Niyamgiri is one of those situations because it's the site of it's a hill range in interior Orissa, which is the site of a very well publicized battle between Vedanta, which claims some mining rights in those hills, and the Dongriya Kond community, which is a community which has which has a lot of integrity even in the present day. Its traditions and its lifestyle are still relatively intact, and they're defenders. Their whole religious sort of viewpoint and their social system makes them defenders of their land and of that hill range. So it's a very beautifully expressed crystallization of the problem we have about tribal communities and natural resource extraction. And anyone who's seen the film Avatar, directed by James Cameron, the word went around that this was inspired by the Niyamgiri struggle, which sounds kind of frivolous. But I recently watched Avatar on a plane, and I totally believed it. The movie Avatar is a form of, in a sense, a form of propaganda. But I really appreciated it, and I thought that it helped to see the problem from a different side. Because one of the problems with news, with relying simply on quick-moving news in order to understand the country, is that to really understand all of the different communities and all of the different situations, sometimes we actually have to really change our frames of reference. It's not just about getting all of the facts. Sometimes it takes the work and the focus to understand big questions and words differently, and to understand what livelihood means differently, to understand what development could mean differently, to understand what wealth or rights or all sorts of things. So this is what I saw when I tried to give more time to understanding the Dongriya Kond. I think it's fair to say that we have two sort of presiding problems in this country. One is that we don't have enough livelihoods for all of the people. We call it a jobs crisis, but we just don't have enough ways for people to support themselves. The other is that the forms of lifestyle that we are moving towards right now are just way too environmentally costly. They're really unsustainable. This expresses itself most obviously in our kind of trash crisis, which is very serious. So not enough livelihoods, and the livelihoods and the lifestyles that do exist that we're moving into are less and less sustainable. This is a huge problem, right? It's a problem on a really epic scale involving hundreds of millions of Indians. But there are also quite a lot of Indians who have livelihoods. They have livelihoods in the present, and those livelihoods are sustainable. And they are very numerous, these Indians. And basically, to use a very broad brush, we call them tribals. And what do we do with those people who have livelihoods? This is a generalization, and I know that there are lots of ways to sort of problematize these. But what do we do with these tens of millions of Indians who have livelihoods and whose livelihoods are sustainable? We want them to stop. We want them to stop. We often want them to leave. We often want them to leave their land. But even when we don't want them to leave their land, because not all tribals live on top of a pile of natural resources, but many do, we want them to modernize we want them to receive a kind of education that is standardized with all of the education that we receive, and then to mainstream into the same world that we occupy. Now, I understand why this is. Everyone has a right to that education. Now, this is the other side of the coin. Most tribal communities are extremely poor. They have terrible fatality rates. They have terrible maternal mortality rates. And the Dongria Kon, for instance, have a literacy rate that's very, very low. It has to be one of the lowest in the country. So we also see, what we're also seeing in these communities is poverty. And that's one of the things we're trying to fix by the ways we impose education. The story that I found in Orissa, in short, is that because of various things, because of the topography, because of the risk of Maoism, the state government is pulling out government schools from villages across the state. They're just every year there's like 1,000 fewer government schools or so.
Why is that?
Because it's hard to do. You have to. These are small schools. Teachers, they're a management challenge. Teacher truancy and security and just it's a governance delivery issue, right? It's simpler to remove those schools, create large residential schools in urban areas, and then bring lots of tribal children when they're very young and stick them in those residential schools. And then they spend their entire youth in a hosteled education.
In a city?
In a sort of district headquarters or whatnot, in a semi-urban, out of the forest, essentially. Here's the problem. This is, as any administrator will tell you, this is a far more effective way to deliver what we consider modern education. It also is a very effective way to completely uproot them from the lifestyles, to the extent that those exist, that I just described. Their lifestyles in their tribal communities, in their ecosystems that have historically existed, that are both sustainable, valuable, and give them the dignity of belonging to their tradition and to their culture. So what do you choose? Do we see it as poverty and a public health crisis?
Right.
And do we attack it by trying to kind of like disrupt these communities and like pull them into the urban economy? Or do we see it as sustainable economies that exist all over India that just need some help but also need to be respected and understood and preserved, so that we deliver the help that we're able to support them and give those people the choice about how they continue and how they move into the future along with the rest of us. And at the bottom of all of this is some very interesting questions about how we're allowed to be in the modern world. Our modern system is not one that any of us would depart from. I don't want to live without modern amenities. Right. Or modern medicine, or
education for that,
or the education I got.
Yeah.
But viewed differently, we can't keep going this way. It is literally not sustainable, and we say that to each other all the time.
Right.
But we're doing nothing to move fast enough to adjust to that.
So more than the livelihood issues and everything else. And their rights more than anything else. There is also, I'm assuming, this is going to completely cut off, and one of the inadvertent casualties will be the knowledge that they possess as a race, right? Both of nature, of the fertility of their environment, and things that are just passed on by generations, right? Who's helping them fight this war?
Well, this is going to be a little bit, this is a little bit of provocative statement, but the people who are helping them fight that range from very committed and inspiring individuals who sort of work on the ground there, who run, sort of like independent schools that offer education without uprooting tribal children, who run health facilities, who also run at the bottom of the Niyamgiri Hills, for instance. There's a wonderful organization called Living Farms, which just works relentlessly with those communities, but respectfully, to try and preserve their knowledge of agriculture, because they have an extremely kind of the Dongria Kon have an extremely deep and interesting sort of intellectual legacy. They have their own intellectual heritage, and it's real. We have to understand that when people say things like this, they're not being condescending. They're not being politically correct by just saying that, tribals also have their own. They do, and you can have an intellectual legacy that's not written in words but conveyed orally. If we say that, to deny that is to say that most humans in history had no intellectual or cultural legacy at all. because literacy is really a very recent thing. Okay, and the fact if there are communities now that still remain very partially literate, we still have to respect them enough to understand that they can still have a cultural and intellectual legacy. And a lot of that has to do with cultivation. A lot of it has to do with ecosystemic knowledge. It has to do with understanding the nature of the biodiversity in their particular in their sort of ecology. And a good example, if this isn't too specific, is that the ways in which the Dongria Kond cultivate, and the ways in which many tribal communities cultivate for various reasons, are multi-level. That is, crops that grow at different heights from the ground, and multi-seasonal. So the crops that are planted at the same time ripen and are harvested in sequence, right? And for other reasons as well, this actually makes their cultivation much more climate resilient in certain ways. So their natural form of cultivation there, because of the way it's adapted to avoid the kind of crisis that they're vulnerable to, which might be wild animals eating it or a particular kind of, because,
Well, what do they cultivate mostly?
So they cultivate lots of things. They cultivate millets, they cultivate fruit. I think that somehow pineapple got introduced there, and they're really big fans of cultivating pineapple, bamboo, a variety of things that, they're not completely adequate.
Right.
When I say sustainability, I'm not saying that if we just sort of built a fence around this hill range, that would be the ethical solution, and that they would live happily within there. They might actually want to try it because they have explicitly voted against having their hill range penetrated by certain kinds of, modern disruptions. But no, they want to trade. And what the government should be doing is helping them by establishing fair terms of trade with local traders who, because they still want, what they trade for? They want matches. They want biscuits. They want a variety of things that are entirely sensible, useful commodities.
Right.
There's kinds of cloth. And of course, some of them want mobile phones. That's not surprising at all. So it's by no means impossible to find the balance that enables them to preserve their intellectual legacy, to learn about what lies outside, and to make decisions and negotiate their way into the future, as opposed to what we're doing right now, which is really very explicitly tearing them out of their place in their community and their ecology, so that these kids who spend ages 7 to 18 in hostel education, you can't go back.
Right.
Yeah. You can't go back, and you don't have the skills, nor do you have the conditioning to have that choice anymore. You've been deprived of it.
Fascinating and deeply disturbing at many levels. We're almost out of time, Raghu. We usually end the episode by asking the guest what he or she is reading or listening to. I know you're an avid listener of podcasts. What are you listening to these days?
Well, I keep going back to Hardcore History, which is, I'm going to guess that you know it, but it's Dan Carlin's excellent and kind of raw-edged series of long-form historical essays about big moments of trouble in human history. I like that very much. And well, I'm blanking on the rest, but I'm also a fan of IVM podcasts, and I hope that this grows and builds a podcast culture in this country as well.
Yeah, we're certainly hoping so as well. But I think there's been a huge infusion of Indian podcasts in the last couple of years, thanks to people like IBM and many others as well. Yeah, I think a lot of narratives are emerging which didn't exist earlier.
Yeah,
which are not necessarily the same as the popular discourse. So I'm looking forward to this for the next couple of years in a very excited manner.
Yeah, I mean, we all need a break for our eyes, to be honest.
Exactly.
That's the deciding factor for me. Is I want to be able to read and learn without using my eyes, because I use them too much the rest of the time.
Right. Anyway, wishing you all the best. Looking forward to your next book, and thank you so much for being part of the Filter Coffee
Thank
podcast.
you so much. It's been my pleasure.
So that was our show. If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcasts.com. You can also follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to reach out to me, I am _Karthik. That's Karthik with an H on Twitter. And filter_coffee. That's coffee with a K on Instagram.
Sachin Tendulkar, Virat Kohli, Don Bradman, and now Cyrus Brocha. Okay, probably not in the right company. I mean, Don Bradman is Australian. But it's called Cyrus Says, a wonderful show about everything. Find the show on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Cyrus Says is brought to you by Storytel. Keep in mind that if you go through storytel.com/IVM, you get a 30-day free trial as against a 14-day free trial on the link. Right? It's very simple. All you got to do is log on to storytel.com/IVM. Millions and millions and millions of stories, many written by me.
Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta. I'm B50 on Twitter. I am the host of Paisa Vaisa, a show that talks money. On my show, I speak to experts from every field of money and finance, from stock markets, equities, debt funds, credit cards, life insurance, every possible area of money and finance that you can think of. We even did an episode on cryptocurrency. I've got fantastic guests from mutual funds to personal finance experts everywhere. Robo-advisory, startups, just name it, we've got it. At Paisa Vaisa, we help you make smart decisions about money. You work hard for money. Now make your money work hard for you. New episodes out every Monday, and you can listen to my show on the IVM Podcast app or any other podcasting app that you have. Paisa Vaisa is brought to you by Paytm Money.